And then there's this. The newly installed acting U.S. attorney for Washington, D.C. is launching an internal review of the department's Capitol riot prosecutions. Ed Martin, who has been an advocate for January 6th defendants, made the announcement in an email to Justice Department colleagues. Martin referred to the review as Project 15-12, which is a felony obstruction charge that was used against hundreds of Capitol rioters. The Supreme Court ruled last year that the charge was too broadly applied. Martin wrote, quote, "Obviously, the use was a great failure of our office, and we need to get to the bottom of it." Before he joined the Trump administration, Martin was a Stop the Steal advocate who spoke at the Capitol on January 5th. It was on the grounds of the Capitol during the riot. As the mob was breaching the building, Martin tweeted, "Like Mardi Gras in D.C. today. Love, faith, and joy. Ignore hashtag fake news." Meanwhile, several career lawyers involved in the prosecutions against Donald Trump have been fired by the Justice Department, specifically more than a dozen officials who worked on special counsel Jack Smith's team, which investigated Trump's handling of classified documents, along with his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. In a statement to NBC News, a Justice Department official explained, quote, "The acting attorney general does not trust these officials to assist in faithfully implementing the president's agenda. This action is consistent with the mission of ending the weaponization of government." Willie.
For more on this, let's bring in NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delaney. And Ken, good morning. If we can go back just for a moment to Ed Martin, we heard the soundbite there on January 5th and January 6th. He was on the grounds of the Capitol saying this is like Mardi Gras in a tweet. Not only that, though, he was the attorney for at least 3 January 6th defendants, one of the leaders of the Patriot Freedom Project that advocated for January 6th defendants with these big fundraisers at Trump properties. So what exactly is his directive now as Donald Trump deputizes him to look into this?
Good morning, Willie. Good morning, guys. Yeah, well, as you said, he's asking the office to go back and investigate every use of that obstruction of an official proceeding statute that was widely used to prosecute many January 6th defendants and then was somewhat narrowed in a Supreme Court ruling. He's portraying this as an inappropriate act by prosecutors, something that needs to be investigated. And I would just point out that this is the office that prosecutes crime in D.C., where there is not an insignificant amount of crime. And this is at a time when the Justice Department is suspending new hires. So there's a manpower shortage, essentially, and he's tasking an undetermined amount of people to go back and look at all of these cases to see if anybody did anything wrong instead of investigating crimes in D.C. and elsewhere. So it's quite remarkable, but actually not unexpected, guys.
So, Ken, talk to us about how this fits into a broader look and reshaping of the Department of Justice, which, of course, Trump made so center during his campaign, firing prosecutors involved in the Jack Smith investigation. Where else could this be going right now as we all wait to see what happens with his selections for Attorney General and FBI Director?
Yeah, Jonathan, I mean, I have to emphasize, look, elections have consequences, obviously. And when a new administration comes in, they do, first of all the political appointees at the Justice Department leave, which happened on January 20th, and they do change course, of course. And sometimes they reassign members of the senior executive service who are career civil servants, but actually are sort of quasi-political appointees. But this goes way beyond that. This is a shock and awe campaign that the Trump administration is waging at the Justice Department. And this act of firing these career prosecutors who worked for Jack Smith, this is really stunning. I mean, it's hard to explain to the public because they probably think, well, of course he's doing that, right? They investigated the president and he comes in and he's firing them. It just doesn't happen. And it appears to have been illegal because these are people who have civil service protection. You can't just fire these folks. You have to have cause to fire them. There was no cause or proper cause given in that letter. No allegation that they did anything wrong or acted inappropriately or were incompetent. And so they're going to appeal these filings and they'll probably win, but it won't matter in the end because their careers essentially at the Justice Department are over. And many of these people were very accomplished career prosecutors. And it's sending a message to other people at the Justice Department, get in line or your job is in peril. And I'm talking to people across the department who are sending me copies of memos that go out every day. There is a lot of deep, deep concern, not just about the typical change of policy that comes with a new administration, but a fundamental reshaping here, and a message that really tries to deter enforcement of the law.
All right, NBC News' Ken Delaney, and thank you so much for that reporting. We appreciate it. Ali, it's very interesting that in so many of these things that are happening, that are moving forward, Ken was just talking about how possible civil service protections were violated in the firings of these Justice Department officials. You could look at the firing of the inspectors generals. And of course, that went against the legal requirements that the Senate be given a 30-day notice. You look at the grants being frozen, provided by the United States Congress, and therefore within their constitutional realm, and not the president's to freeze it. And people talking about how that also will present great legal challenges. You can go down the list. So many of these things, there are legal questions on whether they're going to even be upheld or not. Certainly, there are going to be, just dozens and dozens of legal challenges. And I suspect many of those will probably be held up. But that's not really the purpose. Whether they get held up or not, that's really not the purpose of doing this all at once right out of the gate, is it? I mean, this is, as Ken said, it's a shock and awe campaign. Yeah. And what sticks, sticks. And what doesn't stick still sends a message.
Absolutely right. It's setting the tone and tenor of this administration. It is underscoring the fact that they won the election. And it also tells us a lot about the way that this Washington is different than the one that Trump walked into in 2017. Both internally in the White House, there are far more people here who either learned the lessons of the last administration, that they needed people around them who would not be checks on them, but they also learned how to pull the levers of government. And then over on Capitol Hill, many of the folks who ever bucked the Trump administration found the door themselves or were voted out of office because of primary challenges backed by more MAGA-aligned candidates. So this really tells a story of the Washington that Trump is in. But then there's also the way that they are trying to do it. They have a very public campaign on things like immigration that polled quite well, that voters say that they voted for. And then they have the things that are really rooting out the parts of government and bureaucracy that don't work for them. The kinds of things where Ken is able to say, well, I know people don't know this about career prosecutors, but that's the kind of stuff that Americans might not latch on to as much because it's not a hot button issue on the campaign trail, but it is the way that government functions and the way, frankly, that small d democracy stays stitched together, especially through the Department of Justice.
Joe.
Yeah. John Meacham, I'm curious your thoughts on the firings and the other actions over at the Justice Department. And if you want to just speak more broadly, more sweeping on what's happening with immigration, of course, as Ali said, and many of these things popular with American people, certainly on deportation, on immigration cases, certainly up to a certain point. And also Donald Trump going in and sort of taking on this strong man role. That's what people voted for while he was saying things that were deeply offensive to many of us. The American people are getting so far what Donald Trump promised them to do. You can talk about that on one side. On the other side, though, compare the firings of the IGs, compare the firings of the Justice Department officials, compare all of this activity over the first week or so with Nixon, the Saturday Night Massacre, the other things that we're used to talking about here when we go back through history and talk about presidents pushing the boundaries of their constitutional powers.
Yeah, this is the imperial presidency without any kind of constraint. You're exactly right. It's what people voted for. There's no mystery here. There was no mystery given the American experience of the last 9 years politically. It's a hallmark of not a democratic lowercase d system, but more of an autocratic one. I think you all are exactly right that it's not just the actual firings, the actual people going, but it's then the ensuing chilling effect. And I don't know about you all, but I know this just out in the wild. They're in different kinds of institutions. If you have any kind of connection to the federal government, there are a lot of emails going around about how to watch yourself. And, it's a devastating phrase, I think, because it has this kind of Orwellian overtone. That said, before, people go crazy, you're right. There are some things that should be disrupted. But the issue with this particular disruptor, which I think of as this is a 14% question. So 35% of Trump's base, don't hold me to these exact numbers, but I think this is pretty close, would follow him anywhere for anything. The people who put him in power are a lot of the folks that we know pretty well. Joe, you and I have talked about this endlessly. It's the 14% who are MAGA adjacent, who are doing it for taxes, or did it for taxes and judges in 2016, right? And then couldn't quite get there with Vice President
Could not
Harris.
pull the lever for Kamala Harris. Could not do it. They could not do it.
And so they've taken this.
I'm just emphasizing that, John. I'm sorry we have a delay. I'm just emphasizing that because for those that have one excuse after another excuse after another excuse, you go through and you go, well, that's not true. Well, that's not the case. Well, that fact pattern is completely wrong. And then they just end up by going, I just can't vote for her. Like she is a San Francisco radical, 2019 debate, blah blah blah. But anyway, that was their final line of defense for voting for Donald Trump.
And that's why I think the Wall Street Journal editorial page today, the piece you read about Senator Cotton, who I salute for saying this, saying what he said about the national security officials who, in the defense of this country, put themselves and their families in harm's way, and then a petulant king is going to punish them? Let's just be very clear here. We don't have to harshly attack everything President Trump does. We don't. But when he does something that should be harshly attacked, it should be harshly attacked. And chilling effect be damned. Because if there's full-on universal preemptive surrender, then we really are, as my grandmother used to say, past where the buses run, right? It's just not going to be recoverable. And again, not being hyperbolic, I don't think. You damage something that is organic and fragile and tender at the best of times, and that's American democracy and American institutions. You damage it, it's very hard to fix it. And so therefore, the argument is, I think, that there's plenty to be fixed in American life and democracy. But do we have to do it so bluntly and with such an emphasis on the loyalty to a single person and not to the idea?
Right. And by the way, what you're saying is not radical or extreme. What you're saying, specifically on what I've brought up today and what I've brought up over the past several days, I'm always reading from the Wall Street Journal editorial page, whether it was on releasing cop beaters, and that was their words, that Donald Trump made a horrific mistake in releasing cop beaters and promoting violence in the future by doing that. But also, of course, by yanking Secret Service protection from those who actually did his bidding in the killing of Soleimani, and actually, as Senate Intel Chairman Tom Cotton says, still have contracts on their head from the radical leaders, the radical mullahs in Iran.